Hello, this is Lisa. We're back again with more Passover snacks, some little videos concerning the Passover Seder from Creation Gospel Workbook 6, Standing with Israel. And in this little snack, we want to look at what is ridiculous. You say, what is ridiculous at a Passover Seder? Yes. If you've ever looked at an Orthodox Haggadah, you've read some things in there that might be a little bit puzzling. And the answer is going to be because we fall asleep. If we look at Yeshua laboring in prayer in the garden prior to his arrest, what do we see? His disciples keep falling asleep. Why do they keep falling asleep? Well, it's been a pretty intensive day. They've been preparing all day for Passover. They've had a big meal. They've had some weighty things dropped on them by the Messiah. And as the time draws near, as it gets closer to midnight, what do? They keep falling asleep. Their bellies are full. They've had 4 or 5 glasses of wine. They're just sleepy. And that's the answer, because we're sleepy. So one of the things that you might read in an Orthodox Haggadah sounds a little bit ridiculous if you don't really understand what's going on in the context. And this is why the Orthodox Haggadah can throw a lot of non-Jews if they don't really know the background of it. So this should help. And just to sum up, and I'm using just a basic Haggadah here, it talks about these different rabbis who were discussing the miracles at the sea. And it says, Rabbi Yosef, the Galilean, said, "How does one derive that the Egyptians were struck with 10 plagues in Egypt, but with 50 plagues at the sea?" All right, and then we go on, there's a discussion here. And then it goes on, it says there were 50 plagues at the sea. And then Rabbi Eliezer comes in and he chimes in and he starts adding to the plagues. And he says, we can conclude that in Egypt they were struck by 40 plagues and at the sea by 200 plagues. And you're thinking, what in the world? Are we reading out of the same Torah? Are these rabbis crazy? And then Rabbi Akiva chimes in. Just when we thought things were off the rocker a little, Rabbi Akiva says, "How does one derive that each plague that the Holy One, blessed is He, inflicted upon the Egyptians in Egypt was equal to 5 plagues, for it is written." And then he goes on and discusses a little bit. And he says, "Therefore conclude that in Egypt they were struck by 50 plagues and at the sea by 250. All right, so that should be enough to convince us. We're just not sure what these rabbis are getting at. But remember, I've already told you the answer. The answer is because we fall asleep. It's a joke. It's designed to keep children, and I guess in the case of Yeshua, it would have helped to keep grown men awake. After you've had a big meal, after you've had 4 cups of wine, what do you tend to do? You tend to get sleepy. Some of us get sleepy long before we've had a big meal and 4 cups of wine. But this is something very common, and in terms of a lot of this Mishnaic literature that we're talking about, there might be jokes on there, but you don't know they're jokes if a rabbi never told you it was a joke. Remember, it came from an oral law that was passed down from person to person, from mouth to mouth. And therefore, there are going to be things in the text that you would know had you been a student, but otherwise you have no reason to know. We know that there's all sorts of customs like this that were designed in ancient times to keep children awake. And I found one custom here that was still practiced in Iraq by Middle Eastern Jews even into the early 1900s. And one of the things that they did is they would take the afikomen of the matzah and they would tie it onto the back of the youngest child. And what was the point of that? Well, the same point of making up these ridiculous numbers of plagues in the Haggadah. It keeps the children awake because the children hear that and they know that's not right. So now you have their attention. It's the same thing with this custom here. You take the youngest child, the one who's most likely to fall asleep, you take the afikomen, you tie it up, and you put it on its back, because now all the other children are after him. And they're going to keep him awake. They're going to keep him from falling asleep. And even the question of the 4 questions. Remember, this is part of the Haggadah, and you say, well, how old could that possibly be? Well, it may not have been first century, but again, by the same community of Jews who are probably going to retain more of those ancient customs, there's still a custom of acting out even parts of the Exodus to keep the children awake. So the same way that the 4 questions would function in a normal Jewish Haggadah, they were doing things like even play acting in their seders. It said in this one instance, the children went out of the room with pillows, blankets, matzot, and other paraphernalia, and as they reenact the long journey through the Sinai desert, they wait outside for a few minutes. Then they knock on the door, and the adult inside says, "Who is it?" "Israel," answer the children. "And where do you come from?" the adults asked, still sitting around the large dining table. "From Egypt," the children answered. "Well, where are you heading?" "To Jerusalem," the children answered in a joyful chorus. "And what do you want?" asked the adults. "Why is this night different from all other nights?" The children break into a loud song and the adults join in. Right? So what are we seeing here? Pretty much the same thing as the 4 questions, except the children are literally acting out these questions. So by getting the children involved and actually doing something, and sometimes doing funny things, like having a dialogue, like making up a ridiculous number, tying the afikomen onto the back of the youngest child so that the other kids will pester him and keep him awake. Those are all just part of teaching your children. That's what good parents do. And the more interactive the Seder became, then the more likely they were to remember the important parts about the Seder. Syrian Jews had a very similar custom. The guest would say, "Where do you come from?" And then one of the participants would say, "Egypt." And then the guest would say, "Where are you going?" And the participant would say, "Jerusalem." And then the guest would say, "What are your provisions?" And then the participant would say, "Matzah and maror." So those sorts of enactments were just to keep both the children and the adults, like Yeshua's disciples, asleep during the Seder. So what's the answer to the question? Because we fall asleep.